first panel, entitled Cloud Computing Impact on Data Governance in Financial Services. This panel allowed me to introduce our panel moderator, Mr. Peter Koo. Peter and I go back more than a decade, dating back when the role of the Chief Data Officer and the discipline of modern data manager was just emerging. Peter's the Chief Strategist at Informatica. He's responsible for defining and leading Informatica's go-to-market strategy for financial services, has over 20 years of experience in enterprise software strategy, marketing, and business development, and is a regular speaker at industry events, and is the sponsoring chair on behalf of Informatica's membership with the EDM Council. So Peter, you're our first one to go off, so let me turn the screen over to you.
Great, thank you, John, and thank you, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. I'm actually here in sunny California. We are dealing with some interesting times these days, so the fact that we're all here together on Zoom just shows you how technology is really enabling business success across all industries. I want to talk about a topic here that I believe the word cloud will eventually go away. But what people are doing and what companies are doing, they are investing in cloud technologies, whether it's to help drive better customer experience, to combat fraud, to lower the cost of doing business. And we know that cloud is no longer a science experiment or something that organizations look at as a nice to have. We see organizations across the industry adopting, whoops, go back here real quick. If you can go back to that slide there, John. I'm not sure, let's see. All right, so what we see is organizations obviously adopting technologies, whether it's the JP Morgans of the world, the Deutsche Banks with Google, HSBC with AWS. Many of the leading financial institutions across the globe have made investments in cloud technologies to support their business. At the end of the day, we also see that the technologies associated with cloud are adopted in different means. First of all, we see organizations adopting cloud as more of an infrastructure as a service, where organizations are basically taking their technology, their data, and hosting it on the cloud provider's platform. We also have organizations that are offering hardware networks, where organizations are now just managing their data and the processes associated with their solutions. Informatica, for example, offers our data integration and our quality solutions as a platform offered on our cloud service. And I think most organizations and most consumers, when they hear about cloud, they think of software solutions where people, all they really need is a device and a browser, where you're accessing Salesforce automation tools from Salesforce or HR systems to Workday. And we know that cloud is becoming mainstream. And we also know that cloud computing, this market is huge, close to $200 billion in spend just last year, with even more organizations spending beyond what they had originally planned for just 3 years ago. And that 24% of the spend in cloud computing is actually coming from the financial services industry. It is mainstream, folks, and the word cloud in front of computing will eventually go away. It is computing, and that will be how organizations invest in technology. The benefits associated with cloud adoption vary. Many organizations that look at cloud, they originally see this as being a cheaper alternative to running technologies on-premise. But at the end of the day, it's more than just cost savings. It's about business agility. It's about ensuring that you have modern capabilities to compete with non-traditional players, whether it's the hyperscalers of the world out there, like the Amazons and the Googles, or of course, the emerging fintech community. When we think about cloud adoption, this illustration shows where technologies are being lifted and shifted. New applications are taking over existing ones that are traditionally running on-premise. And all of these systems have to integrate, talk, and coordinate with each other. Data has to be integrated. The quality of the data has to be managed. Security, as John mentioned, is critical. You also have the requirement to tell and explain where is all this data coming from. And if you thought it was difficult to explain and answer those questions when your data and your systems were on-premise, well, adopting cloud doesn't actually make it any easier, because we all know that in the financial services industry, we're really good at adopting new technologies, but we're really bad at getting rid of the existing ones. And then, of course, data governance has a new set of challenges and requirements as more business organizations are adopting their own cloud solutions. The coordination and the governance of technology, data, along with people is going to be critical going forward. So we're going to explore some of these areas, but really being able to answer some of the questions that I believe are being asked on a daily basis. For example, is the data that you need available in the systems that you just recently invested in? Can you trust it? As we talk about data quality issues, this is something that I believe has been a moving target across the financial services industry. It's very difficult to manage good quality data if you don't have a strong governance framework supporting your organization. We talked about explaining where that data comes from. Is the data what you need in order to support your business needs? And again, we talk about sensitive data. I've talked to many organizations where they are building out cloud data lakes, for example, but they're concerned because they really don't know if private information is being sent into the lake and what's happening to that data in the lake and then out of the lake. So these are some of the questions that we're going to explore, and I want to introduce our panelists today. Joining me is David Hardoon. David is a senior advisor for data and artificial intelligence from the Union Bank of the Philippines, and also Radim Zajicek, data strategy and governance manager with the Australian Securities Exchange. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me. You hear me?
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure, Shori. It's the ritual taking off the mute button.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys. You know, when we were preparing for this session here, we were talking a lot about cloud and what cloud actually represents to organizations, not just in financial services, but in every industry. Some of the examples I went through there in terms of infrastructure, platform versus software as a service. I'd like to start with a question. I know your organizations are obviously established organizations. You have a lot of technology that's been invested over the years. Where does cloud sit in your companies? So if I may start with you, David.
Yeah, sure. No. So we've actually had for the last few years what I guess will be considered a cloud-first strategy. And over the last, several months, and definitely with the encouragement of the COVID-19, a cloud-only strategy effectively. So it's absolutely important. And the reason for that is, I guess you would call it twofold. The first and foremost, to a certain degree, having a digital agenda is that degree of scalability, is to make sure that we're able to go from, be it 1,000 or 100,000 to 1 million customers with effectively the same ease and dexterity, without suddenly have to worry about large-scale infrastructure, putting things in place. Is that you have that underlying flexibility, which is one of those key narratives that comes from cloud environments effectively. The second one, which kind of is half ironic, is, and I say ironic with, half joking to it, is actually security. It's having that degree and resilience, because now to a certain degree you can outsource and have the from an operational point of view, from an administration perspective, from a security point of view, a lot of the things that previously you have had to have that overhead, one person to X racks, you can suddenly scale that equally in a very flexible manner. So it is fundamentally those. It is terms of how to assure we're able to leverage on the data that we're collecting, how we're able to scale operationally from the operational systems all the way to the data science, and engagement, so there'll be the applications, and so forth. So it's absolutely been parallel to the strategy.
So Radim, how about your organization? What have you guys invested in over the years?
Look, I think we've took a slightly bit more conservative approach, and we probably started with the smaller use cases, the typical mainstream back office applications such as the Salesforce or the ServiceNow players of the world. There's been a few instances around the infrastructure as a service, so we've been tapping into those. We do run some of the private cloud. We use some of the big data analytics platform that we run, DataSphere. So we're hosting it in the cloud just to take advantage of the elasticity and the speed to the market for these applications. So they're the main focus areas for us. At the moment, just sort of evaluating what are the other options out there.
Now, you mentioned different solutions, both software as a service, infrastructure as a service. One of the illustrations that I showed, there's different ways of adopting cloud, and there's multiple clouds that companies invest in. I'm curious, is that the strategy at ASX, which is more of a multi-cloud implementation rather than just going with one or two vendors?
Oh, look, most definitely. So again, I think, maturity-wise, the cloud has progressed to the point where, as a customer, you can pick and choose. And why would you try to lock yourself into one solution? Why would you try to lock yourself to one provider? So we're certainly keeping all the options open and considering the providers on their merits.
Yeah, in fact, sorry, I was just about to add to Radim's response, which I think definitely illustrates it, is ironically is also the lock-in is a detractor. It's about having the degree of that flexibility and knowledge is that you're not bound for all eternity, because at the end of the day, one of the many key benefits is making sure that it's a fit for purpose with those degree of scalability from the application point of view, and therefore having a hybrid strategy, both in terms of some of the things for eternal we have to be local for whatever reason, but also hybrid in terms of the cloud platform. Some applications just are simply better off natively with certain providers.
It was interesting. I had a virtual luncheon with a CIO group last week, and we're actually talking about the perceptions of cloud technology 10 years ago versus where organizations see cloud in terms of really enabling business success. I asked one of the CIOs, why cloud? And his answer was, because that's where the innovation is coming from. I'm curious, what were some of the reasons for considering cloud versus continuing to invest in your own networks and infrastructure and people, and considering it more of an on-premise investment? Radim.
Look, I think it's a push and pull, to be brutally honest about that. So, obviously market is heading that way. The vendors prefer that, and a lot of the solutions are no longer even available as an on-prem. The cost of running the infrastructure obviously is not getting any cheaper, and there's a lot of innovation that is happening in the cloud, but that is obviously the risk that we just need to learn to understand better and manage better, because people are used to running in all data center methodologies and strategies and processes. They no longer apply in the cloud. So that's I guess that's the task of the governing people to, how do you manage the progression to the new environment and to the new tools. So I think for us, to answer your question, it's the way the market is going, and it's really considering again all the use cases on their merits and do it where it makes sense for us to do that.
How about you, David? What have you seen?
Well, if I kind of take the data science, machine learning dimension and tag that to the point of innovation, absolutely. I mean, one of the core challenges has been the fact that even if you had locally the sufficient platform and infrastructure scalability, I would have a team saying, well, what are you doing? Was that, well, we're waiting for the other team to finish their job. And because of the nature of the world of data processing and data science, again, outside of a more productionalized operationalization environment, is you have that kind of erratic, fluctuousness essentially associated with it. So as I mentioned earlier, is that flexibility is a phenomenal driver to innovation, because if I need to boot up a farm of GPUs, I just boot up a farm of GPUs. It's now a question of cost. It's a question of budgets. It's not a question of I have to wait a month until it's shipped over and it's set up and configured, which by then the project is irrelevant, potentially.
Right. So it's the time to market value proposition. Ultimately, these providers can get it out.
Huge. I mean, if I just may add, I mean, we constantly hear about this whole term of DevOps or DevSecOps, but if a key element in that DevOps is time, where you're spending weeks, if not months, I'm sorry, but DevSecOps becomes a hypothetical window grazing to a certain degree. You need to have an ability of time to market. You need to bring it down, again, realistically for each use case and each scenario. It doesn't have to be real time, but it needs to be as short as possible to allow for that ability to develop, deploy, and push out ultimately from a production perspective.
So here's the dilemma that I'm seeing in the industry. Before cloud became more of the primary areas of investment, the assumptions were the management, the integration, the governance of data. Hey, we'll do what we need to do in order to get by. But what we're finding is that organizations are now realizing that, cutting corners, throwing bodies at the data problem, hoping that the regulators won't ever ask, where are you getting all this data and whether or not your data is protected. Unfortunately, the reality is the data management and governance maturity levels aren't necessarily at the point where they aren't dealing with these issues. So my question is, are these concerns? And if so, what are some of the top data management and governance challenges that you see as organizations continue to invest further in their applications and analytics in the cloud? David.
Look how.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I'll do that because I think all the stuff, all the good things that you've mentioned are actually the biggest risk, right? So in my view, the fast adoption of cloud by the user and the expectations created by the online, and we all used to the iPhones and the App Store and everything available almost instantaneously, creates that massive headache on how do you actually transition to the cloud without doing anything that's out of ordinary or something that is not governed, right? And that's we don't still quite understand through the internal processes, how to do this smoothly. How do we know what data is being moved? How do we know which teams actually jumped on that bandwagon and what they do? Mm-hmm. And I think that is probably the biggest risk. And then everything that comes with that, the confidentiality, the regulators and all that. But I think the biggest risk is really the expectation of the users, the easiness of adoption, where people can move to the cloud really, really quickly without necessarily understanding the risks. And that is really driven by the curve, the maturity curve, where we are in understanding what are the risks and how do we manage them. How much of the risk is managed internally? How much of that is managed by the vendor or the cloud provider? And that sort of that educational piece is, I guess, the role that we really need to play and control. I like the analogy of governance being the brakes in a car, where the better the brakes, the faster you can go because you can stop really quickly. And I think that applies massively in here. Understanding what is happening and how do you manage the progression to cloud, because it's not going to stop, obviously, in a controlled fashion. Oh, sorry, David, I know we are short of time.
No, absolutely. I again, this is one of the areas that couldn't agree more. In fact, I'll add to your analogy that it's not just the brakes, it's actually also the seatbelt, because if you do something happens, it's meant to make sure that not too much damage occurs. Now, I just wanted to add, because think about it, data governance has been there for decades. I mean, we are at a stage where we can say that. And what suddenly happened? Why? Well, let's call it the elephant in the room. All that data that we were collecting, we weren't using. And that's why largely a lot of these data governance issues that suddenly now have surfaced up weren't really an issue, because we weren't really doing anything with the data. We were collecting it for the regulators. We were collecting it for audit. We were collecting it for compliance. We weren't really using it. Together with the adoption of cloud, and well, let me be just entirely unfair, because it wasn't just cloud. It's more about the computational capacity, which was largely also provided by cloud. You suddenly were in a position that, hold on a second, I can actually do something with this data more than just the original purpose that it was collected. And that's when suddenly you go like, oh, hold on a second. Oh, data quality, governance, who can see it, who cannot see it? Suddenly all the things come up. But these things will always be an issue, will always be a challenge, and we'll always find out new things that was going on. Data governance is just like data. It can never be fully addressed, but it has to be done, and they have to go concurrently. And I couldn't agree more with what Radim was mentioned, especially now because of this avid adoption of both data as well as cloud. There's an equal necessity to making sure that the governance environment accelerates, if not as rapidly, close to.
Exactly right.
So I will say this: we've seen a lot of conversations around what organizations need to get done. I think with also the pandemic, there's priorities that have to be met, right? Because budgets are not flowing freely, spend is being scrutinized. So when organizations realize that there are some holes in the way that they manage and govern data, and there are investments required in people, process, and technology, what is your advice in treating those investments in the current scheme of things? Should they be as important as that data lake and the AI solution that you're investing in, as important as the business application, or can organizations just continue to get by throwing bodies at the problem and just using whatever they have? Is it important enough where it is as important as the reasons why organizations are investing in their cloud solutions?
Well, to me, in fact, the majority of applications, use cases, AI, as you're mentioning, are already part and parcel of a SaaS offering, and they're already part of cloud effectively. So to me, it's not a mutually exclusive type of situation. It can be done jointly. And in fact, and I know this might be sometimes a difficult pill to swallow, but if anything, to me, it's a situation of now doubling down because of the pandemic, because of the necessity to see where you can get that maximum efficiency, getting the customer engagement. There is a need of cloud. And just to give you a very brief example, because I know we've been short of time, is we were able to onboard 300,000 people when the branches all shut down. That would have not been possible if that layer of digitalization, if that layer of cloud facilitated environment was in place. I mean, just couldn't do it. So the return on investment will pay for that effectively, ultimately.
Yeah. Well, David and Radim, I think we could probably go on for another 25, 30 minutes talking. I know I could. And I appreciate the opportunity again to work with you both on this topic, and maybe we can continue the conversation offline at another time. So with that said, thank you very much, John and Mike.
Pleasure.
Back to you.
Thank you.